Today we're going to talk about the moon rockets. In this video we're going to talk about the Saturn V. In a future video we're going to talk about the SLS, or Space Launch System. The Saturn V is the rocket that was used by NASA for all of the Apollo moon landings. By the release date of this video, the Saturn V is the only rocket that carried humans to the moon. The Saturn V was propelled by the most powerful engine ever made. It was a giant compared to any rocket ever made at the time, and it is still considered very large compared to modern day rockets. The Saturn V is a retired rocket. It is not being used anymore. The Saturn V was very large, with a height of 111 meters and a width of 10 meters. The mass of the Saturn V while fully fueled was 2,950 tons. The Saturn V was propelled by 5 F1 engines. The Saturn V consisted of 3 stages: the S1C, the S2, and the S4B. The Apollo spacecraft was located on top of the Saturn V, and on top of the Apollo spacecraft there was a launch escape system. The launch escape system was able to propel the Apollo spacecraft away from the Saturn V in case of danger. The Saturn V was an expendable launch vehicle. None of its parts were reused. A new Saturn V needed to be built from scratch after every launch. Before the Saturn V was built, there were smaller rockets known as the Saturn I and the Saturn IB. In fact, the Saturn IB was used for the Apollo 7 mission, which was the first crewed orbital test of the Command Service Module. The Saturn V was assembled in a giant building known as the VAB, or Vehicle Assembly Building. Now, let's take a look at the entire Saturn V flight from the beginning to the end. The Saturn V lifted off the pad propelled by 5 F1 engines. The S1C burned for about 2 minutes and 41 seconds. It propelled the Saturn V to a height of about 68 kilometers. After the S1C runs out of fuel, it separates from the Saturn V, and the S2 ignites its engines. The launch escape system is jettisoned since it is not needed anymore. After stage separation, the S2 propels the Saturn V to a nearly full orbit around the Earth. Meanwhile, since the Saturn V is expendable, the S1C falls towards the ocean and crashes into it. After the S2 runs out of fuel, the S4B ignites its engines, propelling the Saturn V to an orbit around the Earth. The S4B's engine shut down after the Saturn V reached a full orbit around the Earth. The S4B's engine ignites again in order to get the Apollo spacecraft into a translunar injection. A translunar injection is a trajectory where the Apollo spacecraft will reach the moon. However, in a translunar injection, the Apollo spacecraft is not in lunar orbit yet. The Apollo spacecraft followed what is known as a free return trajectory, which means that if all engines fail, the moon will fling it back to the Earth. However, if the engines still work, it can get to lunar orbit. The Apollo spacecraft consists of a command service module and a lander module. When the Apollo spacecraft is heading towards the moon, the command service module will take a 180 degrees turn and dock with the lander module. After that, the Apollo spacecraft will separate from the S4B. When the command service module reaches the moon, it ignites its engines and gets into a lunar orbit. The lander module separates from the command service module and starts descending towards the moon. One astronaut stays in orbit around the moon while two astronauts land on the moon using the lander module. After that, the lander module touches down on the moon's surface. After the stay on the moon is finished, the lander module releases its ascent stage to meet up with the command service module. After the command service module and the lander module meet up, the astronauts that were in the lander module move to the command module in order to return back to the Earth. The command service module ignites its engine in order to return to the Earth. The capsule then separates from the service module. It uses its heat shield to survive re-entering Earth's atmosphere. Then the capsule will deploy parachutes to slow down its impact. The capsule containing the three astronauts will splash down in the ocean. The Saturn V used a propellant mix of liquid oxygen and RP-1, or rocket propellant 1. However, the upper stages used a mix of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. Most of the Saturn V's mass was concentrated in the S1C, or the first stage. It had a mass of around 2,210 tons. After Apollo, the Saturn V was used to launch a space station known as Skylab. Skylab was made out of a Saturn IB second stage. The Skylab launch happened on May 14, 1973, and it marked the last flight of the Saturn V. The Saturn V that was used to launch the Skylab did not have an S4B stage. Instead, Skylab was stored in its place. Crewed missions to the Skylab were launched aboard a Saturn IB rocket. The three missions were named Skylab 2, Skylab 3, and Skylab 4, and they used a command service module. Skylab deorbited and entered the Earth's atmosphere in July 11, 1979. It did not survive and broke up into pieces. And that's the end of our video. Bye, see you next time.